today about one guy, Pellegrino Morano, but it covers a lot of territory, which I'm not going to go over a lot of it. It is the Camaro slash the Camaro Blackhand Wars, but Blackhand at this point is such an early stage of crime in America. Blackhand Mafia are sort of interchangeable, so we'll just go with Blackhand for the time being. But the group we're going to talk about that opposed them, the Morello family, became a mafia family. So at the turn of they were mafia when they arrived in the U.S., but they worked at Blackhand. It was just easy. You put a gun to a guy's head and you stole money from him, or they blackmail people. They blackmail successful immigrants. So it was around the turn of the century there was this proliferation of street gangs. They were usually ethnic street gangs. There were Yankee street gangs. Some of them were enormous. They numbered in the hundreds. In New York, they had black hand gangs. The Morello Mafia family over in East Harlem, which was led by Giuseppe the Clutching Hand Morello. I since found out he was called One Finger on the street, not the Clutching Hand. That was a newspaper thing. Along with his family, he had half brothers, Nick, Vincenzo, and Ciro Terranova. Uh, that mafia family, they originally crossed over, did black hand activities, extortion, that sort of thing. The Morellos were one of the earliest crime families, probably in the U.S., certainly in New York. And over the decades, they would eventually dominate the Italian underworld when they defeated the Neapolitan Camorra of Brooklyn, the guys we're going to talk about. Uh, their predecessors, by the way, the Morellos brothers, became the Genovese crime family. So opposing them, I'm going to correct myself on that, were these Camorra gangs. One, and they were big, one was led by Pellegrino Marano in Coney Island, and the other by Alessandro Vollero. The Camorra, now, so the Camorra, by the way, they had common origins, but they weren't as tight knit as the mafia. It was a lot less loose. For over a decade, these two had pretty much left each other alone. So when I said opposing, they ran different things. Here, as an example, gambling, prostitution, drugs belonged to the Camorra. Uh, the Blackhander slash mafia was big on gambling. Pretty soon, the Camorra realized that the rackets they had, prostitution is tough. The girls kill each other, they kill themselves, they run away with their clients, they go to the police. It's just, that's a lot of work. Drugs, what more can you say? I mean, drugs are drugs. And they thought, well, this is, let's go over to gambling. It's a lot more peaceful. But the problem was, of course, most of the gambling was already spoken for. So Marano, Pellegrino Marano, he's an early leader of the Coney Island Brooklyn Mafia. By the way, they met at his restaurant, the Santa Lucia, which was a big deal in those days. Morano started to expand his empire uh, into lands held by the Blackhanders, and the Blackhanders didn't care for it, obviously, so they responded with an onslaught. On October 1914, they murdered Moreno's top guy, Nick Del Gudillo, of the Gudillo brothers. The Gudillo brothers had started out gambling over in East Harlem. Del Gudillo and his brother Gattino, I'm sorry, once worked pretty closely with Gicio Galusi. He was a politically connected boss over in East Harlem. East Harlem's not so big, but you had all these gangs running around in there. Anyway, he was a crime boss there, and they also had a good relationship with the Morello crime family. The, but it all fell apart. The Grotto lived at 2029 First Avenue over in East Harlem. The building is still there. It's a small apartment building. He owned a restaurant nearby at 2023 First Ave. That is gone now. It's a big apartment building. The cops thought really that restaurant he had was just a front for his criminal activities. So in February 1913, he was suspected in the unsuccessful attempt on Gulucci's life, and he killed Gulucci's bodyguard, Tony Capilongo. I'm sorry, Capilongo. That spring, Delguda, he fled to the U.S., and he fled the U.S. for Italy, smart man, and he returned a year later in 1914. On October, but, Gulucci's not going to forget what he did. And there's only one way to solve this problem in the world he lived in. So on October 14th, 1914, Del Guido and his friend Tancredi della Bado, They met at First Avenue. They walked towards the garage, where Del Guido kept his car. They passed a stable at 421 East 104th Street. That is long gone. It's been replaced by these massive apartment buildings. Gunshot rang out. Del Guido fell dead, and his pal ran off. Good friend. The police later found a shotgun inside the stairs on a window above where the stairs are, and there was a hat which they traced to a guy named Francisco Ruggiero, 403 East 106th Street. And they arrested Ruggiero, but they couldn't prove it. His hat was there. So his brother, Gattino Del Guido, he managed, because he had also gone up against Gucci, and he managed to stay alive for 2 more years. In the early morning hours of November 30th, 1916, he was shot while working in his restaurant, the same restaurant that his brother owned. He died a short time later in the hospital. He knew who shot him. He refused to tell the cops who did it. So in retaliation, Morano has got to do something, right? So he probably planned and set up the murders for Nicholas Morello and Charles Umbriaco by luring them to a peace conference in Brooklyn in 1916. The murders sparked this Camorra Blackhand war that lasted, Blackhand Mafia war, lasted 1914, 1917. Morano had invited the Terranova brothers and 3 mafia captains to Navy Street, where he had an office. There was a coffee shop there. Under the false pretense, he said, let's discuss peace. This is crazy. It's dividing us. So in preparation of the meeting, Morano's guys, they went out and got bullets and they smeared them with, they did this in Chicago too, with garlic and pepper. They thought that would infect the wounds in case they missed. And actually, it doesn't really do anything. Garlic, they now think, probably cleans the bullets more than anything else. So September 7th, 1916, Nick Terranova, Eugene Rubaco showed up at the meeting, but Morano, expecting a much larger crowd, thought, well, the hell, he went ahead with the plan anyway, and he murdered the both of them right on the sidewalks. So blindsided, the mafia, they're still in a state of disarray and confusion because their bosses had gone to jail on separate charges. That's a different story. So then Morano followed this up with another ambush, and he killed 6 Morello soldiers. So in 1917, this is Blackhander, Giuseppe Favaro was killed by Tony Notaro and Ralph D'Amelio, who were both with the Camorra, and they worked for Pellegrino Morano. Notaro and D'Amelio were arrested for the Favaro murder, but before he was arrested, D'Amelio, he was a small-time guy. He wasn't a big guy. He was with the Navy Street gang. He took off to Reno, Nevada. I don't know what that was for, with his 16-year-old girlfriend, and because he had been acquitted on a robbery, abduction charges, and they were after him for anything. So he took off because they knew they were going to get him on this murder rap. So he wrote to Vollero. He said, look, I need some money here. I've run out of money. Please send one. And they refused. So he wrote a letter to the New York City police explaining everything about these gangs, who they were and what they were. So over the next 2 months, D'Amelio he went back to the cops. He told them everything he knew. He saw about 2,000 murders that had been unsolved. He provided leads to hundreds and hundreds of other cases. At the time, it was the biggest mob confession in history. The effect was immediate. Within weeks, dozens of these Camorra guys were arrested, weakened them against the onslaught, because now by this time the Mafia, Blackhand, is a lot more organized and they fight back. Tony Notaro turned state evidence. Both gunmen testified that Morano had ordered them to murder Morello and Umbriaco. Morano was arrested. He was convicted of the murder. He was sent to prison for over a decade. When I was researching him, people said, we don't know what happened to him. He got out of prison. I'm pretty sure I found him. In 1940, the reason I know it's him is his wife was Lena, and he and Lena were living in Hoboken, where he was a bartender. And then he died in July 1954 in Hoboken. So, interesting story.